The Cuban Revolution elevated mass popular discussion about how to raise a new man and a new woman in a society still trying to shed the burdens of almost half a millennium of patriarchal class rule and church dogma. The revolution ushered in sex education and reproductive rights. Revolutionary Cuba is also making qualitative leaps in understanding gender expression. U.S. airport bookstores are lined with pop psychology publications that claim women and men are from different planets. Cuba's mass discussion about the new man and the new woman, which examines new ways to interact, is light years ahead ideologically. The whole premise of the island-wide education, discussion, and debates is that prejudicial and harmful attitudes and actions resulted from old, oppressive economic and social organization, and not vice versa. The mass discussion starts from the understanding that with changed economic and social organization, human beings can change their attitudes rather than being biologically wired to be oppressive, violent, avaricious, or cruel.
So it's talking about, I mean, it says there's the different bookstores. There's the airport bookstores. We're talking about men and women from different planets. Men are from Mars. Presumably women are from Venus. Lenore, where would you just say the average comrade comes from? What planet?
Oh, probably one of the moons of Saturn, I would guess. Titan. One of the cool ones.
Sirens of Titan is a book that we haven't covered on the show. We could.
There we go.
Listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.
Welcome back to the Socialist Shelf. We are coming at you with, Lenore, they've been begging us for more. They said more theory, like abundance, which was a work, of course, of Marxist theory that we covered. It's not Marxist theory, but we did make fun of it a few weeks ago. We do have a more theoretical text today, and we have a guest, Matéo Penado. He is an organizer, grassroots organizer here in Georgia, founder of the Rainbow Collective, committed socialist organizer who is on with us on the show and had some interest in this book. And I believe, am I right in saying you've been to Cuba before?
Yes, I went last August on a brigade with, it was called Law for the People. It's a bunch of legal workers, students, and last year it was a few other community organizers as well. And I will be going again this year on the same brigade.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah.
That's exciting.
Before we get too into the, text here and the subject at hand, there's a lot to talk about. If you tell folks a little bit more, I mean, we want to, the music at the top, y'all heard it when you heard it. It's, I'll peek behind the curtains here. We don't actually listen to the music every single time, folks. So listeners, sorry, we're not just bopping every single time y'all are listening to that intro music. Our bad. But it says read good books and organize yourself. So we talk about organizing as well as reading good books. We want to make sure we highlight good and strong organizing. Would you tell us a little bit about Rainbow Collective, what you do, your experience, and honestly, if there's a way to, tie it into this discussion of, queer liberation and the fight for queer socialism in Cuba. Go ahead.
So I guess context and some background of myself. So you can guess by my name, Matéo Penado, but I am Latina. I am the child of two immigrants. My mother is from Mexico, from a northern kind of border town. A very rural place, and then my father's from El Salvador, and he fled in part because of the Civil War, a civil war that was that incurred because of American imperialist intervention. And I found out recently that actually his hometown was an FMLN base, and it was pretty cool. I kind of suspected when we went when my grandfather died, and I saw a mural of Che Guevara. But after doing some digging, I was able to confirm it, and I thought that was pretty cool. But needless to say, like, I know it's iffy, like identity politics, right? And that can very quickly turn into neoliberalism and some other weird things. However, my identity has really greatly shaped my politics, and seeing how my Hispanic parents, immigrant parents, have been exploited by the poultry factories here in Gainesville. Gainesville, Georgia, Hall County in Georgia is considered the poultry capital of the world. But it's the poultry capital because they are able to exploit immigrants and this labor by people that, again, are being exploited and can't really advocate for themselves out of fear of retaliation. I think almost every single of my aunts and uncles have at one point in their life worked in the chicken factory. It is very extensive, that industry here. And in general, the history of Gainesville, there's a really strong Black and brown organizing basis in history here. And Gainesville has unfortunately, a strong history of segregation as well. And you can kind of still see it now with how the town center is still very predominantly white, and yet you go outside of it and almost every other neighborhood is full of like brown and Black people. It's kind of interesting, especially considering the gentrification efforts. And so, yeah, like in
Matteo,
high
I was
school-ish.
specifically told Georgia is the state that it's too busy to hate. I don't know. That
Ah.
sounds not true to me. I don't know. I keep
Too busy
hearing
to
this.
hate.
It must from the Georgia Democratic Party. It must be true.
Well, if you've listened to our last episode, racism has been solved and socialism's already been built.
Yeah, but go on. I'm sorry. I had to throw that out there. I heard that again today. Something Georgia's too busy to hate, and I'm like, God, wish I
Bruh.
could live in that
God.
world, huh?
So yeah, there's that kind of self-identity, I guess, context. And then in high school is when I finally came out of the closet, and I came out as transgender male and started socially transitioning. I think I was considered like the first trans person to come out in my high school.
Oh, wow.
And I had the extreme blessing and privilege, honestly, of having good relationships with administration and having the support of the principal back then and everything like that. So I had a really easy time.
That's huge.
Yeah. And I had a bit of an easy time. And then I started getting a bit more involved or trying to learn more about LGBTQ based like advocacy and organizing work here in Georgia. A bit after COVID, I started learning about Georgia Youth Justice Coalition and learn about their advocacy work on the Capitol. And I also did an internship at Galileo. And so I just started learning more about lobbying and things like that. And I think it was 2023 where I was just basically watching what was happening at the Capitol almost every day and trying to pay attention to the bills and everything. And in 2023, a copycat from something that passed in Florida, Don't Say Gay bill, was presented and was not passed, barely. But it was pretty difficult. And I know many other LGBTQ youth locally who are struggling so bad, youth and young adults. And I also kept hearing from other people about how frustrated they were, including myself, honestly, about how like we have to constantly drive like an hour to find community and safe spaces. Like in Gainesville, you have to drive an hour to go to Athens, and then on a good traffic day, it's an hour to Atlanta, right?
A really good traffic day, yeah.
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 But that gets frustrating, especially when you know that there's other gay and trans people in Gainesville. We just don't have the spaces or resources for it. And we also kind of lack some of that infrastructure and like the organizations too that Atlanta and Athens has, right? Like there's no Athens Pride Collective. We don't have like a little 5 points or anything like that here. We have to truly start from the very bare bones bottom and then up, right? And so, yeah, after that hard legislative session, I was like, okay, guys, let's do something. And we ended up doing I organized the first Trans Day of Visibility march and protest at the Gainesville Square. And I think like 100 people showed up.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
yeah, really cool. But like the thing is, okay, so clearly there's enough people here. What do we do next though? Because we can't just stand around with signs. We can put this energy to use, and we need to organize ourselves and do something with it. Um, and then we started holding gender affirming clothing swaps on the town square. The town or the city kind of got irked by the permit situation and stuff, because you need to have certain permits to do certain things, and they're like, you can't do that anymore. And we're like, okay. I think the special events permit is like $500-$600, not to mention like some other stuff that you need. And it was like me
God
and like
forbid you stand on the sidewalk like you paid taxes for, right?
yeah. And mind you, it's just like me and TRC is like me and a handful of other like young adults who we are all like broke, and we are Venmoing each other like the same $5.
Yeah.
And we're like,
going
yeah,
around.
no. So we started just trying to figure out other events and things that we could do. Yeah, we just started trying to address some other things that were of concern. Because while we did start out doing explicit queer and trans advocacy work, the thing is, queer and trans people are also kind of working class, and
Right.
there are other concerns, especially in Gainesville. And so, like, affordable housing is humongous. A studio apartment in Gainesville is now starts off at 1,500.
In what's ostensibly supposed to be like a semi-rural area, like
Yeah,
that's wild.
it's horrible. And so, 2023, 2024, I was working for a nonprofit where we were doing some work with the unhoused as well. And we, in general, here in this town and nearby area, we're seeing like the homeless and affordable housing situation crisis worsen and worsen and worsen. And on one stretch of, I think it's JC Jewel, this out-of-state developer based in California, Simpatico, had proposed this mixed-use development. It would have been high-end apartments, hotels, a co-working space, and some other ugly things. And it would have also been on the block where it's like the most porous and like the most brownest block of Gainesville is. And I remember we went and we started door knocking just to like talk to folks and be like, hey, are you aware that this development proposal, that it's out there and stuff, and that this may affect you? And lots of people were like, no, like the notices are coming only in English. We only speak
wow.
Spanish.
But there's a massive Spanish-speaking population in that area, based on my knowledge.
60% of Hawk County is Hispanic.
Yeah.
And I think last time that they tried to get the ballots in Spanish, we missed, because you need to have like a certain percentage of the population to be Spanish speaking, and we missed it by like 0.5%.
Unbelievable.
That's insane.
You'd think, I mean, like just in a sane country, you just would be able to get the ballot in the language that you needed to. There would just be these things on access, no matter what the percentage is. It's a piece of paper. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I remember there was issues with the ballot in Georgia last year, unrelated to language in this case. And they said they couldn't print more because the state of Georgia didn't have the capacity to print more ballots. And I'm like, either you're lying, which is, sad, or the state of Georgia actually lacks that state capacity, which is also very sad.
Well, you know what we need, Jacob?
Sorry,
We need perhaps this could be remedied with an abundance of ballots.
Oh God, Lenore, no abundance.
Have we asked Ezra Klein what he thinks about this situation?
I got him on the phone. I will say too, I got a chance to y'all organized I think the first Pride ever in Gainesville, right?
Yes, period. Sorry to be like annoying gay.
Not at all.
Yes.
That's our brand here.
Yeah, literally slay. That's incredible.
Both of us. Yeah. Ryan's actually the outcast here. Ryan's the outcast among us. We're annoying gays here.
That's why I do the editing.
That's why he's off camera.
Well, if and when I switch to injections, Ryan, I'll pack some in a blow dart just for you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
finally.
hiding, guerrilla warfare. Let's go. Yeah, but I just wanted to highlight that yeah, right in I got a chance to go out to table for an organization I was working with at the time with PSL. That was a phenomenal event, just like on the water, and there was like a great community setting, and just really phenomenal with like good politics and good people and stuff. The kind of thing that like in small towns, or Gainesville is not that small, but smaller towns outside what we consider the major metropolitan areas, in quotes, like people want so much, and there's so much demand for it, and it just doesn't end up materializing. And it's like the community has to make these things happen, and y'all did.
It was so, I loved it so much, and we are working and planning on doing another one this year.
Fantastic.
But yeah, I mean, the politic, I mean, I think it comes down to the fact that the Rainbow Collective, I had named it after Fred Hampton's The Rainbow Coalition, right? Yeah. And so I know about the history of Black organizing here in Gainesville with the Newtown Florist Club and other amazing, like, education-focused Black organizing as well, and folks working against environmental racism. And then I know and have been kind of mentored by some immigration and Hispanic community organizers in Gainesville. And so I was just aware that these are people that are already doing that kind of work, right? A little bit separate and most times adjacent in collaboration with each other. But there hasn't been really much work in regards to LGBTQ, like community and work. And nothing that really is explicitly about class. Like there is advocacy and mutual aid to assist the unhoused, but not anything to kind of counter the vicious gentrification efforts happening currently in town, or to even talk about it or to educate others about it. Things like that. And so I think me and others, like that's what we kind of wanted to start, like, is kind of, how to explain this, like start pulling all of these like different like orgs and folks together and start doing a lot more like collaborative work and tying all of these things together as best as possible. I don't know if that made sense, but yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense.
That's exactly what needs to happen. It's it put me in mind of the intro to today's piece, Matteo. Like yes, identity politics can be co-opted and divisive and all that, whatever. I don't think we need to be concerned about that at all, because as it says, as is very true, as it says right here, we're not concerned solely as socialists with the struggle of labor against financed capital. Obviously, we're concerned with that, but that struggle has to be cemented by revolutionary solidarity among the many oppressed groups. So you have the immigrant struggle, you have the LGBT struggle, you have the unhoused struggle, and that's what you're doing here. Is forging these into a larger working class force, and tip of the hat to you for the work that you're doing.
I think too, it's so important as we think about the kind of text we've chosen today, which is rainbow solidarity, is thinking about that things like the queer rights struggle, the struggle for trans and gay and queer liberation, as a part of class struggle and as a part of broader struggle, not separate from it, right? Is so powerful. And it's how you have the difference in queer liberation with an asterisk if you've got over a certain amount of money, right? Queer liberation if you can afford one of the high rises overlooking the Rainbow Crosswalk in Atlanta, but there are still people who sleep on the Rainbow Crosswalk in Atlanta at night, right? Versus that actual real struggle that is messy and difficult, but is lifting up the entire working class, and queer people seeing themselves as members of the working class because they are, and critically, the working class needing to see their queer comrades as also members of the working class and as leaders in it. And it goes both ways. And I really am like excited to talk some about this, because Yeah, it's so critical to the struggle, and I think people really miss it a lot when they want to say, you know, okay, we're struggling on this issue, or they say, oh, I don't mess with identity politics, I'm worried about class politics, and they don't understand how critical that intersection is, and actually how every liberation movement in all of history, there's never been a liberation movement that's like, we're only talking about like class in the most zoomed out sense. No, people are talking about class and oppression in their very particular context. Every single time you see a revolutionary movement, everywhere, anywhere. And if I'm wrong, email me and I'll tell you why you're wrong, because it's every single time. There's never been a thing that's that abstract. But yeah, before we jump into, I know Lenore wants to talk a little on the author of this book here, Leslie Feinberg. But you mentioned that you had gotten to go on a trip to Cuba. Would you tell us a little more about that?
Yes. So I don't even remember how I heard about it. I think it was from someone who just like reshared it, and they were part of the National Legal Guild. But I saw that they were going to do a legal brigade trip to Cuba, and I work at an immigration law firm, and am interested in that, and also am a community organizer. And they're also looking for community organizers interested in attending. And so I just applied and was able to get in. And so I went the first week of August last year. And we went to go and study the legal system of Cuba. And last year it focused on the people power and how participatory democracy kind of plays out, and how they utilize grassroots organizations and other kind of like orgs and just people power, and how that kind of helps shape some of the things in their legal system. It was amazing. And like, it's so corny to say, right? It's a profound experience, but it was.
Sure.
And it kind of just cemented the idea that I already had of like socialism is the answer, and it does function and work. It's just that Cuba is underneath a blockade, an inhumane, illegal blockade by one of the biggest imperial powers of the world. And yet, despite this, the Cuban people are still so very disciplined, very educated, but also so caring and loving and helpful. And also in learning about the participatory democracy and how the people power kind of orgs do their work, it also cemented my understanding and belief that, hey, grassroots organization and organizing is actually extremely important in order for a socialist revolution to occur. Like, period.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a little confused because I was taught that in Cuba the legal system is basically there's a cop for every single person, and they follow you around with a gun at all times, and if you don't pray to Fidel Castro, you die. That's practically what we get taught here, right? Like, it's like, despite our police being the most militarized in the world, right? Despite our country having more prisoners than anyone else in the world, both per capita and total numbers. And the old joke, there's a prison in Cuba where they torture people underground. It's called Guantanamo Bay, right? It's a dark joke, but it's the fact of like turning it on its head. Like, who is the real criminal? That's not. And so, I'm going to actually link to in the bio of this episode some resources if people are interested in general on the history of Cuba, facts on the Cuban Revolution, things about the blockade, because certainly what we're not capable of doing at this time is giving you a full rundown on the history of Cuba. Even if we could, we do not have the time. That would be an entire podcast in its own right. But I think if you don't feel educated on that, feel free to pause this, go check those things out, because it's very important to understand, especially for socialists and anyone who wants to change the world, or if you just care about like countries that don't want to be under the boot of American imperialism. So important. In this particular text that we've sort of chosen to talk about, ties into these things. It ties into grassroots organizing. It ties into Cuba. It ties into the anti-imperialist struggle. It ties into the queer struggle. And we've got this, just truly phenomenal writer who worked on it, Leslie Feinberg. And Lenore, I believe you've got a bio on Leslie, if you want to.
Yeah. And this is a learning experience for me as well, because I was tangentially aware of Leslie Feinberg, hadn't really gotten into her life.
Had you not?
No, I hadn't.
Really?
No. Stone Butch Blues.
Oh wow, you were in for a treat. I'm glad that you got to do this dive into it, because it is fascinating.
Yeah, no, like incredible life, never slowed down. Yeah, Stone Butch Blues has been on my to read list for a hot minute. It's jumped up several spaces now because, there is no substitute, as we were working our way around to, there is no substitute for going to Cuba, experiencing it, learning about socialism from the people building it. But in lieu of that, there is every substitute in the world for listening to what the U.S. government says about Cuba. You can read about Cuba, you can talk to people who've been there, and then you can understand, maybe this doesn't make any sense to label this country a terrorist state and to have it under a blockade.
You can listen to season 2 of Blowback, the only podcast better than the Socialist Shelf.
True. But yes, Leslie Feinberg, of course, went to Cuba as part of her work with the Workers' World Party, as we'll get into. Made an extensive study there, and the book that we're reading today is essentially a one big report back, one big collation of all the information on the LGBT struggle in Cuba, what that looks like, and what it continues to look like today. Because certainly it's had a pretty consistently upward trajectory.
Yeah, and there have been updates since this book came out that we will get to. I'll get to that kind of at the end after we talk some about the book and after what this book covers. I'm going to drop a little history of what happens after this point in 2009. That it actually,
do you know what? Because
I've got some history in my pocket ready for you.
We've had plenty of episodes, including this previous one, where we had to be like, but despite this, history didn't go this way, blah 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 blah. But this has a happy ending, or at least in the context of the larger struggle, it has a happy ending.
Well, it is interesting when you read like revolutionary texts that have very positive predictions. A lot of times you have to be bummed because they don't always happen. In this one, it was like, they're like fighting to get family codes put in the Constitution. And then it's like me reading it now, I'm like, hey, they did it. You know what I mean?
Literally. I'm
interrupting you. Go ahead. Tell us about Leslie.
No, you're good. So Leslie Feinberg, and I should note here, Feinberg used she, her pronouns for writing to a general audience, also used ze, her pronouns, favored she, her when writing for general audiences. So just for the sake of clarity, that's what I'm going to be sticking with. But this needs to be pointed up.
Yeah.
Her identity was multifaceted, used various pronouns in various contexts. And herself said, look, I've been disrespected with right pronoun, respected with the wrong one. It matters, but the intent also does. So,
definitely.
But Leslie Feinberg, now born 1st of September 1949, Kansas City, Missouri. She was raised in Buffalo, New York, from a working class Jewish family. Her father was a worker at Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, stridently anti-union man, and as we'll see, clashed with Feinberg in several other ways. From an early age, she started supporting herself by working in a display sign shop at a department store. She was a sign maker, and eventually stopped going to school. Somehow, I wasn't really able to find out the details of this. Somehow, like on paper, she got a diploma, but officially dropped out.
How young did she drop out? Are you aware?
No, I wasn't able to find a specific number. Sometime before her late teens.
Wow. So a lot of her education was just, it was on her own or with comrades then.
Oh yeah, in various odd jobs, as we'll see. Mm-hmm. Now around this time, of course, like many LGBT youth, she starts hanging out in the local gay scene, Buffalo's gay bars and all that, because that's where she's found her people. She moves out away from her family because they're hostile to her sexuality or gender expression. By this time, she's come out as a trans lesbian. She legally emancipates herself, and throughout her life makes sure that she's completely legally dissociated from her biological family for reasons relating to her later illness, right? She doesn't want them involved at all with health decisions in the event that she's incapacitated.
Makes sense.
So throughout her late teens and early 20s, she's earning a living with temp jobs at a pipe factory, bookbindery. She's a dishwasher. She cleans out like the ship's cargo holds. She's an ASL interpreter. She does data entry.
She was on the Crab Cannery ship from Crab Cannery ship somehow.
Oh yeah. She actually met one of the guys who but it's the sort of work that she would have done because she's discriminated against as a trans person and cannot find steady work. So this is what she has to do to survive, right? And now it's in 1973 that Feinberg encounters the Workers' World Party. Now, this is one of the communist parties here in the United States. They're still around. They do good anti-imperialist work. And they were certainly doing good anti-imperialist work at that time. She encountered them at a demonstration for Palestinian rights, which, again, for the people who think, the pro-Palestine left just jumped on this issue yesterday. No, this has been around.
No, I will say, too, if you're not aware of Workers' World, if you have been to any big protests and you see a really, really, really good newspaper, probably Workers' World. They make some fire newspapers, let me tell you.
100%. I was leafing through a couple of issues, trying to find one specifically about the KKK march that Feinberg helped to break up and destroy and scatter.
A lot of good literature, a lot of good journalism through the years, including this book.
Excellent journalistic cadence. No, absolutely. So she joins the Buffalo branch of Workers' World, moves to New York City from there, and from then on, that's her calling, right? She's a key figure, throws herself into this in the December 1974 March Against Racism, right? This is in Boston, right at the beginning of the busing crisis, when the Boston school system is resisting integration. White supremacists are rioting, attacking black Bostonians of all ages. And Biden is saying, well, don't want Boston to turn into a jungle,
hopefully that guy will never come to anything.
He's
1974.
He'll probably be a pretty obscure figure historically.
It comes to mind that Terry Bassan, who discussed last week, would have been running in these very similar circles around this exact same time. I wonder if the two ever crossed paths.
That would be incredible.
Same circles, same plays, 1974. Interesting coincidence there.
This stood out to me. During this time, Feinberg and 9 other lesbians go on this all-night paste-up of South Boston at one point. So every visible racist graffiti, poster, whatever, they cover it up.
Oh, wow.
Which sounds like a really fascinating way to spend a night. Feinberg also went on a national tour in 1983 through 1984 to give lectures, raise awareness of AIDS and the U.S. government's denial that it was indeed an epidemic. Yeah. So involved in that struggle as well. In 1988, as I mentioned, the Ku Klux Klan tried to march down Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue on MLK Day. Feinberg was instrumental in organizing a counter-protest that drove those fuckers off. She also worked with Buffalo United for Choice and the Rainbow Peacekeepers to organize community self-defense for gay bars and abortion clinics from that time through about the early 90s when there were bomb threats and indeed actual bombings and assassinations of abortion clinics and abortion providers. So working to organize self-defense against those. Now, like many other organizers, of course, Feinberg also learned journalism. She was editor of the Political Prisoners page of Workers' World for 15 years, made managing editor in 1995, served on the party's national committee. She's up there in the middle of all of it. Now, notably, Feinberg had a 120-part series in the party paper, and this was called Lavender and Red. And this was all about the history of LGBT rights and socialism, where those movements intersected, right? And so her last book compiled 25 of those articles, and that's what we're looking at today, Rainbow Solidarity in Defense of Cuba, and we'll get to the text itself, but I do want to wrap up the rest of her life. From 92, Feinberg was romantically involved with Minnie Bruce Pratt, who she would later marry. Pratt was an activist in her own right. She also served as managing editor of Workers' World at one point. She would live until July 2023. Much more recent. 30 years prior to that, 1993, that was the release of Feinberg's first novel, Stone Butch Blues. And this was a semi-autobiographical sort of novel based on her experiences as a trans lesbian, also touched on her organizing work. This and another book of hers are credited with helping kind of mainstream the terminology, the concepts undergirding modern gender studies. That other book is 1996's Transgender Warriors, which explores the history of trans and otherwise gender nonconforming people. We mentioned on the show, of course, that Joan of Arc was an early example of this. Leslie Feinberg delves into this in great detail. She'd follow up with another nonfiction text, Transliberation, Beyond Pink or Blue, in 1999. A second and final novel, Drag King Dreams, this in 2006. In 2014, after a long and full life of activism, Feinberg died after a long struggle with Lyme disease, various co-infections. Now, this is an infection she picks up sometime in the 1970s, and which went undiagnosed until 2008. She was unable to obtain a proper diagnosis and treatment for almost her entire life due to transmisogyny limiting her access to healthcare, due to capitalist roadblocks on wide sharing of medical research. You know, she was very clear in her writing. She took the recommended course of antibiotics, did not get better. I'm sure there's another podcast out there about the warring schools of thought on Lyme disease. It's beyond our scope. You could do a whole podcast on her 38-part series on her blog called Casualty of an Undeclared War, where she really delves into the politics of Lyme disease. Worth noting, the bacterium that causes it was discovered in 1981. The previous year, federal deregulation allowed the U.S. government and universities to patent pathogens and thus keep research secret to protect future profits. So, you know, kind of a perfect storm there. The last two things she was doing with her life. One, working overtime to prepare for the 20th anniversary re-release of Stone Butch Blues, freely available online. That was her intent. The other thing was organizing support for the legal defense of C.C. MacDonald. This was a black trans woman who was attacked by a neo-Nazi, sent to jail for defending herself. So right up to the end of her life, she's involved in all these fronts of struggle. In 2019, she was honored on the National LGBTQ Wall of Honor at the Stonewall National Monument. This on the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. You know, the current administration is doing its best to erase that.
Matteo, what's your history with Leslie Feinberg? What have you read from her? Do you consider her an inspiration? What's your history with this writer and organizer?
Oh my goodness. It's been a while since I've read Stone Butch Blues, but I have the PDF and a physical copy. And I remember actually immediately after top surgery, a dear friend of mine had given me that physical copy. And I've treasured it so much. And there is a time period in which I was kind of converting into Judaism and stuff, and seeing that Leslie Feinberg was very proudly an anti-Zionist, secular Jewish person as well, was really, I don't want to say like compelling, but I don't know, like inspiring. Yeah. And the things that they were saying, I've read a lot of their speeches. Sorry that I'm using they them. Should I revert back to
whatever you think is better? I think is okay. Or Lenore, you've done more reading on this than me. I've heard it like several different ways. I'm gonna be honest, like because some of the publications were in she. I've heard Z, or I've seen a few things. What if you all know something that I don't, please let me know.
As far as I'm aware, that's as far as I'm aware, Leslie they them was something that Leslie used in certain contexts. I think given the context in which we're discussing her, we can not be too busted up over it.
Okay, cool.
But yes, definitely inspirational. Also, side note, a Virgo, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
Oh yeah.
Same.
And yeah, no, it's their speeches and writing amazing. And you had mentioned something about like just consistently pushing and doing stuff, and the tenacity, and like when you hear them speak as well, there's this one speech explaining why like the flags of countries facing U.S. aggression were used before the pride flag. I just love how Leslie Feinberg explains things.
No, I think that's 100%. That's what I was thinking when I was reading through this. It reminded me very much of the cadence of Workers' World, obviously, but also the best articles that a publication like Liberation News puts out. It's something that takes complex concepts and breaks them down and makes it accessible to a very, very wide audience, which is what you need to do if you want to organize masses of people.
I see Leslie Feinberg like kind of similar wavelength to Kwame Ture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there, I mean, absolutely. And this book specifically that one we're referred to is, just to read from the introduction, quote, Rainbow Solidarity in Defense of Cuba is a compilation of 25 articles about same-sex love and sex/gender variance in Cuba's pre- and post-revolutionary history. These articles make up parts 86 to 110 of the Lavender and Red series, which is run as a feature in Workers' World weekly newspaper since the first article appeared in the June 3rd, 2004 issue. I think it's also worth noting that, 2004 and around that period is a different period. And before that too, we experienced, and unfortunately it's on a backswing, definitely in our younger lives, like a period where attitudes around LGBT rights, while not great, were better than they had been at any point in American history, at least, since the actual founding of the United States. Now we seem to be on a backslide now, and they were never great. But it is interesting too to see that like principled anti-imperialist, socialist, communists who were so demonized by the state were at some of the hardest years to fight for these rights, at the forefront, proudly fighting for them. And I think that's something that like also we should champion, and we should never, as socialists, let anyone take, people want to talk about, what successes have socialists had in the United States? Well, obviously the premier capitalist power in the world has not allowed socialists to take power, but not yet, at least. But, do you think culture has shifted the way it has without these kind of like principled struggles and interventions? Absolutely not. So I think that's important too, that like while we're listening to this and we're talking about this, we understand that this is not just defending Cuba, though that's important, and explaining Cuba, though that education is important, but it's also making an intervention here on what we have the capacity to do. And working with people here, and that's so critical.
Right. The liberal conception of the arc of history bending towards justice always elides and obfuscates the work that goes into bending that arc, and the people and the movements that do. No, 100%. There is a God, and I think what really leaped out at me initially when I was reading this is the way that the imperial core and the way that U.S. imperialism in particular deploys gender and patriarchal conceptions thereof against a formerly colonized country like Cuba, right?
Right.
Theodore Roosevelt, terrible ghost in the pod, of course, he gets a mention here when it's talking early on about how imperialist domination is gendered, right? Roosevelt says, the greatest danger that a long period of profound peace offers to a nation is that of effeminate tendencies in young men. And this is him saying that, yeah, we need to go out, we need to do the Great White Fleet and assert this imperial grip on the world, and what and for whose sake is this aggression? Of course, it's not for working people. It's by the rich and, the very, very rich. And it's always gendered as masculine, as superior, as invincible. And conversely, right, when you have the U.S. empire pinkwashing, right, and attributing this sort of patriarchal paradigm to its enemies, right? Of course, we've seen it all over. People try to discredit Palestinian resistance by saying, racist bullshit like, oh, they would throw you off a roof for being gay or whatever, right? What the patriarchal imperial core is doing here is attributing the ills of patriarchy to these specific people doing hyper-masculinity, in scare quotes, rather than indicting masculine supremacy itself, right? We have no crosswords for, a country like Saudi Arabia or other like U.S. allies that have, very bad, women's LGBT rights situations. This is all in service of fostering a paternalistic anxiety over the women of the imperial core, right? Over femininity, right? It's, if we don't muster a strong imperial fist against these people, they're gonna, do their like version of masculinity to our, purveyors of femininity here, right? It's all very psychosexual, the way that it's frequently expressed.
Lenore, I have to say, that's all very good analysis. However, I was hung up just on the Teddy Roosevelt quote. I can't help but imagining like Teddy Roosevelt today, his like how he would be explaining this. Like, listen, we don't go to war in Iran. All these boys, next thing we know, they're going to be putting on the cat ears. They're going to be putting on the skirts. They're going to be doing TikTok dances. I have to assume that's what modern Teddy
They'll
Roosevelt
become
would be worried
femboys.
about.
Well, listen, a bullet may not have been able to stop a bull moose, but it's going to take a lot more than that to stop a cat boy.
They're going to go
Or a
from
cat
Rough
girl,
Riders to
or
riding
whoever.
something else. Let me tell you. Awful, horrible. I think it's super important though. This book really frames it properly, right? Because it starts with the general context of Cuba, and it talks about at the top what society was like in the Americas and in Latin America and in the Caribbean prior to imperialism. And it doesn't do this like noble savage myth where it goes, and before that, everyone was living in queer polycules, right? That's not true, and we know it, and that's fine. We don't have to expect our pre-colonial humans to have been perfect beings, and they didn't have to be perfect beings to not deserve to get fucking colonized, right?
Right.
But it makes the points. There were queer people. In some places, they were deeply integrated in society. In other places, they were oppressed. In those places where they were oppressed, they were still finding ways to resist, right? But we know what we do know is when imperialism arrived, above all Spanish imperialism, because of that dogmatic Catholicism that was hyper violent at the time, especially that every trace of homosexuality and any kind of gender variance was stamped out and treated with, really stomach turning brutality.
Well, and there again, you see the shift, right, in how European imperialist conceptions of what these civilizations are like. You see a shift again in how they're gendered, because at this time, they're described as effeminate people. They don't have virile strength. And it plays into their the Spanish and colonizer prejudice against like homosexuality, right, and different forms of gender expression. And this goes through like all the way until like the late 1800s, right, until the Spanish-American War. And it's only when these people stand up that suddenly they're considered these hypermasculine menaces.
Yeah, I want to read a quote here. It just says, quote, "An infamous article in the Philadelphia Manufacturer on March 6, 1889, referring to that very period, Lenore, was headlined, quote, 'Do we want Cuba?' Like Nazi eugenicists, the article, written by several powerful Republican politicians, bandied about the pros and cons of annexing Cuba, referring to Cubans as effeminate people lacking virile strength. With the imperialist takeover of Cuba came a brutal restructuring of the division of labor based on the sexes, kinship, family, marriage, sexuality, living accommodations, and other aspects of social organization. The drive behind the changes was the insatiable appetite for profits of the banks and the corporations. U.S. big business, including crime syndicates, organized urban Cuba into a giant brothel, super exploiting the sexual labor of Cuban females and males, feminine and masculine, homosexual and heterosexual. Then came the 1959 revolution. New ways had to be found to criticize and disparage the Cuban people. It became fashionable to imperialist culture accuse Cuban males of machismo, of being too masculine. When Cubans use the term, they're referring to the legacy of male chauvinism and sex/gender and sexual prejudices inherited from centuries of patriarchal rule by colonialism and imperialism. But
also, not to spend every not that we're going to spend every episode glazing Eric Larson, but he has a book called Isaac Storm in which he talks about the Galveston hurricane and which were the meteorologists that were saying from the beginning that it could turn west and destroy this town that wasn't prepared for it? Cuban meteorologists.
Yep.
Nobody listened to them because of white perceptions that they were superstitious.
Yep. And it just ends here by saying that the charge of hypermasculinity against men of African descent has also been a cornerstone of Jim Crow lynch law within the United States as well. Matteo, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this sort of first section where it's setting up how colonialism set up these rigid gender and not just gender, but racial and sexual and patriarchal structures in Cuba, and let's be honest, all over the world to begin with. Thoughts on this sort of opening segment here?
I think the Apocalypto reference really stuck out to me, especially because I remember my mom would play it all the time growing up. Shouldn't have.
Yeah,
but,
will you explain what that section's about there?
This is where Leslie Feinberg is going over the Apocalyptico movie.
That's a Mel Gibson movie, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a Mel Gibson movie.
And
it's about the Mayan Empire. And it's very stereotypical. It clearly, it does the whole, I don't want to say it, the natives or savages kind of shtick. But the reality is that it's the imperialists. Apocalyptico in of itself is propaganda for these imperialists.
You have an interesting this part that's called colonialism, the real apocalypto, and exactly. It's so fascinating that Mel Gibson is allowed. I mean, I know it's a side thing, but he's allowed to keep making movies and shit.
That he's just allowed, in general.
Yeah, but God, between the way he's treated people, racism of his movies, his anti-Semitism. I mean, how much shit do we have to go into with this man? Notwithstanding that, Braveheart kind of kicks ass. It would have kicked ass with another actor too. Come on now, that's not on him. But this book talks about some very interesting examples of pre-colonial queerness, and I think it's important on two levels. One, because it doesn't, whitewash it. It explains it in what was going on. And also because it's this is a thing that is cropping up in all human society. This is natural everywhere. And, that's an important thing to highlight. It says colonial observations about same-sex love and sex and gender variance in indigenous societies in the Western Hemisphere are copious. Those with imperial aspirations studied the people they sought to militarily conquer and enslave. When a European expedition in 1576 reached the lands of the Tupinamba people in what is now northeastern Brazil, they found female-bodied hunters and warriors who were accepted by the other native men. Recalling the Greek Amazon warriors, the Europeans dubbed the river that flowed through the area the River of the Amazons. Narrating his first trip down another river, called the Mississippi, Jesuit Jacques Marquette described the 17th century how among the Illinois and the Nodawesi, he found people who would today be referred to as Two-Spirit. And he describes that they were summoned to the councils and nothing can be decided without their advice. And it goes on. Like I said about several of these books, y'all should just read it. It gets into the details. But it makes the point that, there are these societies. And then it talks about in Mayan society, it wasn't perfectly accepted. But it says, what I am trying to show is that in pre-Hispanic Mexico, alongside the rigid Aztecs, there existed and there exist today other more flexible cultures, more tolerant of homosexuality. The Mayans had a more favorable view of diversity within the community, which suggests greater tolerance of homosexuality, above all when concerned with religious rituals and artistic practices. And the fact of the fact of the matter is things like Apocalypto, it says here, serve people who want a Fourth Reich. It serves people who want us to talk about actually colonialism was good. I mean, it was messy, but we got it done. And it also gives that justification for that cowboy colonialism of, at the very least, we should control the Western Hemisphere, which is definitely a force in the MAGA movement that I notice. They're the people who are get us out of the Middle East. We need to be focused on invading Mexico. A real type of guy, looking at Tucker Carlson. And I feel like this kind of logic so often gets brought up with them. And it's such a perfect framing going into the struggle of revolutionary Cuba. Any other thoughts on this from either of y'all before we go into the next section?
No, 100%. I mean, it's crystallized in, Communists did not bring anti-homosexual prejudice to the Americas. The development of class societies and colonialism did. Of course, there were there were societies that were in the early stages or had quite developed class structures in which these things took place. No question about that. But it was industrialized and reified and set in stone, certainly, by the arrival of the Europeans.
It's it gets into some interesting stuff here where it talks about, as the 20th century goes on, is there formal colonialism? Not in Cuba, but what you do have is US-backed dictatorships and multiple US interventions directly with military and continuous supply of capital and guns to repressive regimes. Not to mention the just finance capital. I mean, just really just destroying the island, and the mob being a very big deal on the island, which a lot of the sex trade was happening, which was led to severe abuse of the homosexual community in particular, but also lesbians, trans people all over.
And precluded as well, like we mentioned that there were instances of what we would consider LGBT representation integrated into ritual practices, integrated into various aspects of society. You don't have that in colonized Cuba. It is, as you say, Jacob, it's relegated to this commodified form, to this underground.
I find it interesting, though. In 1915, you've got Luisa Capetillo, a Puerto Rican labor organizer who goes to do some work in Cuba with the Anarchist Federation, and this person is basically like queer baited. Is basically like not queer baited. What's the word? No, it's queer baited. Yeah, like red baiting. It's queer baiting. That has another connotation too, though. Because queer baiting is also, people use that in like that fan fiction queer baited me. So maybe I'll use another word for it. Ryan, cut this. I meant it like red baiting, whatever. Luisa is called out for wearing men's clothing, which is, wearing a suit. And we have a picture of it. And Luisa looks very good in the suit, to be clear. I would wear one too if I looked as good as that in it. But like, and they're using this idea that, someone is a gender deviant or whatever as a way of breaking up organizing, as a wedge issue. And I'm like, this is more than 100 years ago and they're still doing this shit, which drives me crazy. But you also see that this struggle is ongoing, right? It's also not like something that cropped up later in the 20th century. I think we like to think of these things sometimes as, and then the queers showed up. And it's like, no, we've been here. And actually we've been like on the front lines the whole fucking time.
It just reminds me of also like the Musha in Oaxaca, Mexico. I think they Musha are more predominantly in like the Oaxaca area than Mexico. But Musha is, I don't like to like, well, I guess you can kind of think of them in the same vein as the Two-Spirit. Pero Musha tend to be, they learn the skills and trades of both sexes. And they're seen as like the caregivers of the town and trained and just, but however, now they're also the victims of femicide and other kind of atrocities. Whereas they used to be very revered and respected, but now in part because of these horrific ideals and the oppression that colonialism and imperialism brings, and just the forcing of this binary that only serves certain interests is horrible.
From here, it gets into really, we have an entire section about just before the revolution, talking about the sex trade in Havana, the stuff that was going on with the mob running prostitution rings and, dirty casinos and things like that. We get a lot of research here that is cited from B. Ruby Rich and Lords Arguelles. I'm not sure, but we get from them. What it keeps citing them, but I don't know if it ever says what like paper or book that they actually wrote that this is cited.
Homosexuality, Homophobia, and Revolution: Notes Toward an Understanding of the Cuban Lesbian and Gay Male Experience.
Okay, you found it instantly. It's that one. So it pulls from quite a bit from that on stuff that happens prior to the 1980s, right? And so you have immediately following the revolution, right? And we won't summarize the whole revolution, but the working class rises up in Cuba alongside other people who don't want to be oppressed any longer, alongside, peasants and even like, business owners and stuff who were like, we would rather not be under the thumb of American domination. Thank you very much. And now a new society is born, right? But the new society, the new state, isn't automatically born without the prejudices of the old state. And that is something that's so important for us to understand here in the imperial court, especially. It's like, the old joke of like, well, the communist state that I'm building in my head is better than that one. You know what I mean? The one that I've got like in my brain is better than Cuba or wherever you're picking, versus understanding like lived conditions. So I would always say, if there was a revolution in the United States tomorrow, you think we'd be perfect? You think, all the Trump people that are now still living in the country are going to stop being like transphobe? Like, what are you talking about? Right.
Yes. So Lenoretopia would be perfect from day one.
Okay. Well, Lenoretopia would, but Lenore, what is your plan for executing Lenoretopia? I'm curious.
Well, there's going to be a lot of executing that needs to be done. No.
So much. Yeah. Your perfect world is just you and Sheila. Nobody.
Yeah, Sheila does the thumbs up or thumbs down, and spoiler alert, she doesn't have thumbs.
Just little white feet, little white paws. But it's important to raise this because this book then gets into the struggle for queer liberation in Cuba post-revolution. And one thing that gets referred to quite a bit in Cuba is the fight for women's liberation, which is, of course, directly linked to this, which is referred to as the revolution within the revolution. That is a term that's used quite often in Cuba. In fact, I heard the President Diaz-Canel of Cuba speak. I was honored enough to get to meet him when he came to New York City. And he referenced the revolution within the revolution when he was speaking as well to an American audience. Which,
you want to talk about what we mentioned last week, maintaining continuity between the revolutionary moment, the initial revolutionary moment, and today. It seems that they're doing that very well.
Let me tell you, when I say there were the amount of police and Secret Service and like not to protect him, let's say that like. The United States was trying to intimidate this man, and he just was like not sweating it at all. It was super fucking cool. And in fact, like the crowd, when they're like chanting with him at a certain point, like the Secret Service agents lining the room looked like they were like actually kind of afraid. And it was really fucking cool for his protection. But none of them were standing close to him. They were leering over the crowd. If anyone from the crowd had wanted to charge the stage, they could have easily. Interesting how that works. Just as a side note. But this starts immediately after the revolution. And I raise all that to say is because once a revolution happens, the class struggle is still happening. The fight for queer liberation is still happening. The fight for women's liberation is happening. And what this book doesn't do is do this like, just like it won't do a noble savage myth. It also won't do the noble, perfect socialist country myth that, magically everything was just like you'd like it in your head. No, they were human beings. And what are y'all's thoughts on this? What are some examples from this book about the struggles towards queer liberation that took place post-revolution that stuck out to y'all?
La Federación de los Cubanos Mujeres is so amazing to me. I had the honor to listen to some women who were involved in the FMC last year. And I mean, I think there's a quote of him speaking about how the Cuban Revolution would not be possible without the women at all. Just not possible at all. And I think, the part of revolutionizing the sexes with going hand in hand with FMC, because I remember they spoke about combating the machismo, and of course it's not a perfect revolution. It's not a perfect state. I don't think that could ever be feasible in real life, that they still kind of deal with it. However, a lot of the political education efforts and also the popular education efforts that they did in the beginning of the revolution were so helpful to be able to combat a lot of these very harmful type of lines of thinking and the actions of like violence and harm that was being committed And also like, and I've even noticed like in interacting with others there that there's not, yes, there's something here in the line about how just simply aim to change old ways that men were taught to interact with women. Crazy enough. And I noticed over there that sure, I'm sure that there are still issues with machismo and things like that, but it wasn't so blatant. It was so obvious in your face, like you see it sometimes here in the United States, or that you face in day-to-day life sometimes, right? And like the woman is just as respected as the man. Some cases, I think about 70% of women in Cuba are employed and have an education. I would have to look at the statistic again.
There's been so much that's been done to break down these to break down the traditional sexism of class society, and of course oppositional sexism too. Of course, there's been incredible strides that Jacob, you'll eventually get into, in recognizing the greater gender variance, in recognizing the full spectrum of gender identity. No, absolutely. And it's interesting to me how, as that's going on, as the foundation is being laid for that, even as that is happening, you see the United States almost instantly. Like, you talk about how, it takes work for a society to change its fundamental attitudes. How it takes work for building socialism and and deconstructing the bigotries of the old civilization, right? The ruling class, conversely, of the imperial core can turn on a dime when it comes to what they enforce and what they don't, right? What they consider, deviant and what they don't. And I'm thinking in particular of, how the Immigration and Naturalization Act in the United States of 1952, right, specifically bars entry and mandates expulsion of quote unquote sexually deviant immigrants, right? Cuban homosexuals, that whole community, on the eve of the revolution, becomes an exception to this, right? Because there are wealthy, like nightclub promoters, like figures in the Cuban underworld, that whole underground sex industry scene, that come over, and suddenly they and their workers that they bring over are very useful to the United States, right? Suddenly there is a cottage industry, as we see in existing socialist countries today, the DPRK, for example, right? There's a cottage industry suddenly of people who are brought over and who are incentivized to say, "Hey, we faced all this oppression in this mother country, and wouldn't it be nice if somebody came over and undid this revolution that drove us out?" Right? There are unmistakable, economic incentives and coercion going into building this narrative of a gay exodus from Cuba. Not that LGBT people didn't leave Cuba on the eve of the revolution, but there are structural factors that are frequently left out.
Lenore, I think that you're not listening to everyone's voice. As Ted Cruz said, his father was tortured in Cuba. Now, his father was tortured under Batista, but he still hates the socialists for that, even though they're the ones that overthrew Batista.
Well, Batista was a quitter.
Batista was a quitter.
On that specific issue, Batista was a quitter.
He was also a quitter on his country. He could have fought for longer. His ass ran away pretty fast, actually. If you read about the revolution, it shows what punks.
What didn't he like die in exile in Spain or some shit?
Yeah, he ran away like so fast. It was crazy. Like he still was theoretically way more powerful than the revolutionaries, but like he was like, we lost a battle. It's over. But that shows the fragility, right, of ruling class power. I think I recently read the book, and it's not a perfect book, but I think it's good. Cuba Libre. It's a book from a couple years ago. It's I don't agree with all its political stances, but it has a lot of includes a lot of really good like first person sources and things like that. And one thing I found interesting too is it like doesn't shy away from the fact of like during, the uprisings that were leading to the Cuban Revolution itself, not all of these like fighters that were working for like Fidel were like perfect guys. They were very imperfect guys. When Celia Sanchez, really Fidel's like right hand woman, would come around, sometimes they would make sexist jokes or whatever. And she was like, okay, there will be no bullets in your gun when we go out next time. And he was like, no, wait a second. Because, she's controlling all the ammunition and doing all the math and all of the whatever, literally the tactician really, the logistics really of the entire thing run by.
I love when women.
Yeah, it's so cool. I wanted to read this too, just on the struggle for equality between the sexes. Quote, following the revolution, women won near full equality under the law, including pay equity, the right to childcare, abortion, and military service, among other historic gains, laying the basis for their higher social and political status. This foundation, a first in the Americas, played an important role in women's greater independence and sexual freedom, a prerequisite for homosexual liberation. The revolution also destroyed the mafia-controlled U.S. tourist-driven prostitution trade that held many Cuban women and gay men in bondage. The revolution undertook to provide ample education and employment opportunities for female prostitutes. Advances for women in general were naturally extended to lesbians, and many became the most ardent defenders of the revolution. And this is actually a recurring thing in the book, is that actually lesbians on average, especially in these hard years, were more likely to be more ardent defenders of the revolution than gay men. I'm curious if either of y'all had thoughts on that.
So I just think it makes sense to me that lesbians were more, ardent defenders of the revolution than potentially cis gay men.
I guess part of it maybe is just like, women gaining so many rights so fast, right? Rights that, not necessarily yet the rights to be lesbian or gay or queer, but the rights that weren't had previously. So
Yeah,
paved the way for everything else.
Yeah, and you have that extra axis of oppression that is misogyny. These things do compound and produce a more revolutionary mood when the conditions are right.
The book then gets into it gets into both talking about some of the myths that have come up and have been propagated, and also talking about the real struggles that occurred. It talks about the UMAP brigades of 1965, which is a thing that gets thrown out. These are the units to aid military production brigades. This is, shortly following the Bay of Pigs invasion and there is a live threat that the United States will invade Cuba at this time. The blockade is in full swing. There have been biological attacks on the island. There have been terrorist attacks. There have been bombings from the United States. There have been assassination attempts, all manner of violence, covert and overt, against this small island 90 miles off the coast of the great empire, the United States. And in this period, it gets into here these basically they needed like assistance for the military, and they had like workers brigades and things like that. And part of that was at the time due to what would later be admitted, anti-homosexual bigotry. There were people who did not want gay people in the military. That was a thing that was going on in Cuba. And there was also, resistance to having people of certain religious denominations in the military. And due to that, those people were recruited into these work brigades. And the theory behind it was not that this was going to be dishonorable. A lot of people were going to work in it, whatever, but there were abuses of it. It was not concentration camps. They were not fucking work camps where they were mass killing people or whatever the United States wanted to claim, while they were actually mass killing gay people, right? But there were abuses. Fidel Castro himself admits there are abuses. And you have this interesting bit where it says Fidel Castro at one point, curious about this, just went to a camp in the middle of the night himself and just like slept in one of the hammocks and was just chilling. And like a guy came in the morning and just saw Fidel Castro sleeping in like a hammock. And then they end up sending 100 guys to like covertly infiltrate the camps to see what the conditions are like, specifically how the people running it are behaving, and they decide to end the program, and they self-criticize on it. I'm curious what y'all thought about this and other instances, because like through these years of the 60s and the early 70s, Cuba has not yet really, and the 70s in general, has not really yet been broadly won over to, the queer liberation, or that not the general populace has not escaped these bigotries. It's not escaping as fast as it's escaping, sexism and things like that, and racism. Not that those went away immediately either. What do you think accounts for this? And what do you think of the way this book and the discussion, it frankly handles the challenges while also addressing the, frankly ridiculous slander of U.S. imperialism on this topic?
Well, I mean, what leaps out at me is, Leslie Feinberg in these texts is, unflinching when it comes to the, the genuine problems that Cuban society and Cuban individuals, more frequently than there's not really a to the degree that there are systematic prejudices against LGBT Cubans. Of course, these are resolved through the framework of the revolution. And of course, she doesn't shy away from depicting individual Cubans' experiences with family, with perhaps getting hassled by police at points. There are moments where there are people who engage in these sort of bigotries and who have to be corrected, certainly. And what jumped out at me is that part of many straight Cubans' prejudice against homosexuality in these cases, especially where the UMAPs, right, the military units to support production, especially where these brigades are concerned, it seems to me, part of many straight Cubans' prejudice against homosexuality was its perception as a commodity for the consumption of wealthy foreign exploiters, right? Because that's where the to the degree that a gay community was allowed to exist, that's the context it existed in, and it doesn't excuse these chauvinisms, certainly, but it does explain where they came from. And that's what leads to ultimately the disbanding of the UMAPs, right? The integration of gay Cubans and of there were gay Cubans, there were particularly religious Cubans, there were less educated Cubans that were in these brigades. And what leads to the integration here is, okay, like, we can't have these people siloed off while we have yet to deal with the prejudices against the people getting siloed off, right? They aren't being siloed off specifically on the basis of identity, but nonetheless, there are people who are going to work out their authority in that way. So we had to find another way around this. So that intrigued me. And again, like, we'll see this at several points. Like, there are moments where the state is not perfect, or indeed still working out old chauvinisms. And again, you see foundations like the Federation of Cuban Women, like Senesex, within the purview of the state, through which people can express these very legitimate grievances that they have.
And yeah, speaking on this period, you have a couple quotes here with Fidel Castro talking about overcoming chauvinism. He said, "Concerning women, there was a strong prejudice, as strong as in the case of homosexuals. I'm not going to come up with excuses now, for I assume my share of the responsibility. I truly had other concepts regarding this issue." And then he says, "Homosexuals were certainly discriminated against, more so in other countries, but it happened here too. Unfortunately, our people, who are far more cultured and learned now, have gradually left that prejudice behind." And finally, from a speech in 1992, "I'm absolutely opposed to any form of repression, contempt, scorn, or discrimination with regards to homosexuals. It is a natural tendency and human that simply must be respected." So you also see the evolution not just of the people, but also of literally the highest levels of leadership on this issue due to mass participation. And I do want to talk about that.
There's a lot more material basis to what he's saying here than to any U.S. ruling class flack going, "Love is love,"
Yes. And saying, love is love, and I changed my mind, and here's why. Versus like Hillary Clinton, who saw the thing went from 49% approval of gay marriage, I'm against it, to 51%, I'm for it, right? But there was a lot of organizing and hard work from the working class, from the bottom up, from grassroots, as we talked about earlier, that made this change. Do either of you want to speak to the type of grassroots organizing that was necessary to make this change happen in Cuba and how it was able to happen in a socialist society?
The Cuban National Union of Artists and Writers were pretty vocal about the treatment of folks in the UMA campus. And even that in of itself, I think, is highly interesting as someone who is also a cultural worker.
Yeah, they get into some stuff on film that's very interesting. Which is, it's fascinating because there's some like Hollywood movie that's very like, oh, it's so bad to be gay in Cuba movie. What is that film called? Is that Before the Night Falls? Something like that?
Before Night Falls.
See, I only remembered the titles of the good ones.
But like, you have like America doing that while, you know, simultaneously leading up to AIDS, which we'll touch on, and while, you know, repressing violently homosexuality and trans people at home, as Leslie Feinberg found out in their own life. But you see, like, yeah, this mass work had to make the change. I like this. It says, talking about people who are organizing. Cubans continued to organize mass forums for discussion and debate that empowered changes concerning sexuality, sex, and gendered social roles. 2 years after a 1971 Congress declaration that no homosexual should officially represent the country, it was overruled by a Cuban court. In 1975, any limit on employment of homosexual in the arts and education were overturned, which the court ruled in favor of gay artists who were petitioning for compensation and reinstatement in their workplace. That same year, a revolutionary family code was adopted that called for equal participation by men in child raising and household work. Also in 1975, the Ministry of Culture was established and a commission to study homosexuality. And all of this came very much through the push of people from the bottom up. It came from these artists. It came from people at all rungs of society. And it came from, in a lot of cases, feminist organizers who were able to see the intersection between the feminist struggle and the queer struggle, which I thought was really cool. Including Raul Castro's own daughter, who is featured fairly prominently in this book.
Mariela Castro, yeah. No, the in particular, like, film intrigues me, the role that it plays here, because there is this whole, there's this whole decade of cultural progress in the 1970s, and then you have movies later on, like Gay Cuba, like La Cara Oculta de la Luna, Hidden Face of the Moon, and the national conversations that they spark fascinate me, and I really want to delve deeper into that. There's a quote here from a journalist, Ricardo Ronquillo, who's discussing the national conversation around La Cara, the film. It would be worrying if we thought of ourselves as a wholly agreeing society with neither competing arguments nor opposing positions in the face of its most intimate conflicts, or even worse, that silence prevailed. Now the film they're talking about here, it's a telenovela. It's not a film, called The Hidden Face of the Moon. It's about AIDS. It's about youth sexuality, all that sort of thing. It being discussed in this context of, like, it would be worrying if we thought of ourselves as a wholly agreeing society. Like, to my mind, like, this phrasing is familiar to any dupe who lives under capitalism and considers themselves a free speech absolutist, right? Like, what it means in a socialist context, I kind of want to grapple with. Like, our journalist here isn't saying that opposing viewpoints, I think AIDS is a gay plague versus I think AIDS is a disease that needs, like, proper study, absent of bigotry. Like, this person's not saying that these two viewpoints opposing are equally valid. He's saying that Cuban society and culture is still grappling with old bigotries in the course of building a free and equal socialist society, right? And, like, telenovelas like this, films like Strawberry and Chocolate, which is about, a gay Cuban organizer and a straight Cuban organizer, working out the differences. Movies like these examine and discuss and interrogate the degree to which these bigotries are prevalent, rather than allow them to compound, right? Rather than to treat them as solved, right? The struggle isn't over just because on paper you're equal. You have to work out, what people's attitudes are as well. Because keep in mind, right, in the context of this debate, of this national conversation, there is no focus on the family in Cuba. There is no Family Research Council in Cuba. There is Cenesex. There is the Federation of Cuban Women. There are organizations within the purview of the state whose goal is to break down these barriers, right? There's no
How can we have freedom, Lenore? How can we have freedom if we don't have the Heritage Foundation? If that's not allowed?
I mean, in that case, fuck your definition of freedom, right? Like,
right, exactly.
We could use a little bit of authoritarianism for certain things.
Yeah. James Dobson, I'm so sorry that you don't have, you don't get to write your books, but all for the price of being cool, being a cool country. Yeah, I think too, like, it's notable that this Strawberry and Chocolate, like, is the biggest film in Cuban history, I think, still. Like, it was massive. And it was especially interesting that this film came out and had to be worked. They had to work hard to get this thing out in a period of the worst period of the blockade, following the fall of the Soviet Union, when Cuba was really and truly basically alone against the United States, when it was like difficult to get a pair of shoes.
When the director falls ill and has to be replaced halfway through.
Right. The socialist government was focusing on giving the people what it could, which was a rich cultural life, right? Which is, costs very little comparatively, but also the amount of work that went into making this, and the amount of people that even in this difficult time really wanted to see this film and engage in debates around gender and sexuality and grow. And I think that's genuinely phenomenal. I found this was interesting from this is from Dr. Celestino Alvarez, who was the director of the National Institute of Sex Education in Havana, one of these really forward-thinking organizations that the government kind of has empowered to make change in society. And she said, the First Party Congress reviewed all the things that the Federation had asked for and converted them into a political directive. This is the only country in the world where the people who have suffered from the consequences of ignorance, principally women and young people, did not have to spend 1 minute to convince the highest levels of leadership of the country that something had to be done. On the contrary, the political leadership was always worried that they weren't doing enough of what the women expected them to do. I'm convinced that doesn't happen in any other country in the world. I think that's important, very important. And that's referring to the 1977 conference, I believe. Matteo, did you have any thoughts on the cultural aspect of this? Because I know you said you do culture work yourself. I know Rainbow Collective is also. I mean, there was all kinds of cool cultural stuff at the events that I've attended. Any thoughts on how culture is able to change this mass consciousness and what that can and should look like?
Oh my goodness! I recently have been looking more into the socialist realism movement and art style. And just recently, I was reading this letter that Diego Rivera had written. And just, I think this kind of is everything that should be said. Is he had said, there's a great need for artistic expression of the revolutionary movement. Art has the advantage of speaking a language that can be easily understood by the workers and peasants of all lands. And it is something that, art typically historically has been for the bourgeoisie. It has been something that rich people typically can only commission, can even look at, as most of it has only been kept hidden away in their stupid private galleries and collections, just left to fester and collect dust. And so the masses don't really have much to look at aside from whatever propaganda is put out by the exploitative state. So when there is a class revolution, there should also be a cultural revolution to accompany it. A little shout out to Mao, I think. And so I think it's really important to recognize and emphasize the need for cultural work and cultural workers. And it may seem minuscule, however, it does change things. It is a great catalyst for change. I learned recently that she's actually a gusano. However, I was first introduced to this idea of acto util by the Cuban artist Tania Brugueria. And that is her epitome of the concept of acto util, is that art needs to be a catalyst for change within someone. It should force them to change their thought or enact some sort of material action, and help assist them in doing that. And so, I mean, even with the films, the Cubano films, it provides people with this ability to like start doing that, to start having a change in thought, and also start challenging some prior beliefs and thoughts, because this doesn't happen in just 1 to 5 years. It's, I mean, we keep emphasizing this, but it is true, and it needs to be understood bluntly that no transition to socialism is rapid, nor is it going to be well, it can be rapid, but it's not going to be perfect. And the cultural work really does help to kind of, I don't want to say, well, smooth things along, and it's very helpful for the people in the masses, to say the least, I think.
Yeah, I also think it's important that this revolutionary art can be, Gramsci talks about being this sort of this nucleus of the world to come already existing in the previous world, right? Like it has not yet shattered out of the old world. It is not fully, but like the revolutionary can create art that gestures to the future, that yes, inspires action or inspires thought or inspires, that is up to the artist, the revolutionary artist. But if it suffuses the work and it drives people towards action, that's great. Now, we must be careful, of course, that under capitalism, we don't say, I did my consumption of revolutionary art for the day. Now I've done my socialism for the day, right? Listening to this podcast does not, we're not really art, but you know what I mean? Does not make you a revolutionary. It maybe can help you. Maybe it can encourage you. Maybe it's funny to you, whatever. Reading this book necessarily does not make you revolutionary. Watching a revolutionary film doesn't. But if it pushes you in that direction, if it activates you, if it makes you a better revolutionary, then there you go, right? Like that's what it needs to be doing. And I feel like that's important as well. It's not just consumptive. There is an actual interfacing that the subject does with the art, if in a really truly good revolutionary art.
There is a dialectical relationship certainly between the cultural side of it. And Matteo, I'm glad you brought that up, because there is, to me, that is where the science, that is where the science, right? That is where scientific socialism. That is where practice sort of meets the theory that you have to inculcate in this population, right? And it's in my mind where this jumps out at me, where this puts this theme into practice, is the bit where Mariela Castro Espin, Vilma was the mother, Mariela Castro Espin, right? Raul's daughter, director of Cinesex. She's talking about how the Cuban state, how Cinesex carries out its AIDS education, right? And she's like, well, we could do a couple of things here, right? We could have an epidemiological approach to preventing AIDS transmission. We could go out and we could plaster, all the billboards in Cuba, all the walls with use a condom, use a condom, use a condom. And this is the right thing to do. But what it doesn't address is sexism, right? Male chauvinism, male entitlement to pleasure, right? An attitude that might lead a man to be confronted with this information and to decide not to use a condom anyway, because he doesn't like how it feels, right? And to pressure your partner into consenting to that, perhaps, which of course is not consent. So what Cinesex's safer sex education is doing here is tackling masculine chauvinism itself. It's emphasizing that using protection is part of caring for your partner, right? This is part of not simply imposing the correct answer objectively onto the population, but contextualizing it in the new man, in the new woman that's unmoored from this previous bigotry, right? This new person that's capable of carrying out this healthier approach to building a society. There's two sides to it, right? There's the scientific, there's the cultural, and a truly revolutionary project doesn't divorce these things.
Yeah, it's worth noting too that going into the 80s in 1979, Cuba officially repealed the law, the pre-revolution law, criminalizing homosexuality. This is over a quarter century before the United States does it. And in 1981, the Cuban Ministry of Culture publishes a publication called In Defense of Love, that is stating that homosexuality is a variant of human sexuality and that homophobic bigotry is, quote, an unacceptable attitude inherited by the revolution, and that all sanctions against gays should be opposed, end quote. And this going into the 1980s, right? Going into the period of the worst time of the AIDS epidemic, in the start of it, is so critical, right? Because you look at how the United States responded to AIDS with all the resources in the fucking world, right? And the abject, I won't even call it failure, because the Reagan administration was happy to let gay people die.
It was
and
genocidal.
Drug users die.
Let's call it, yeah.
Right, exactly. So I won't even call it failure, because it was really going more or less how they would like it to. But that response, with it being called the gay plague, with you have these moral majority folks that we made reference to, right? Saying, oh, this is gays getting their just fruits and whatnot and all that, versus Cuba saying specifically, we're not going to talk about this as a gay disease, because first of all, it's not just a gay disease. Newsflash. We're going to talk about the things like Lenore was talking about, taking an actual scientific approach, and also like a dialectical approach too, like in the sense of looking at this is a material situation and within a set of material circumstances, and we are going to make a calculated, smart decision, not just like what is like the right decision or what feels like this abstractly just, like making an actually smart move before they understood how the disease was spread, creating basically apartment complexes for people with HIV AIDS to live in.
These, of course, were slandered in Western media as concentration camps for AIDS patients.
Which is absurd, because they had everything they needed. They were given ambulatory services if they needed to go to work. Their jobs were kept for them in perpetuity. And they were allowed to leave as soon as it was determined how the disease was spread.
Imagine falling ill with a debilitating illness and not having to leave your job for lack of insurance, for lack of ability to pay for medical care or whatever.
And this is happening again in this poor country that is blockaded by its neighbor to the south, or to the north, and its neighbor to the north. Yeah, it is being done by Jamaica. Its neighbor to the north, who is literally, letting, gay people and drug users and anyone else who happens to be unfortunate enough to get AIDS die in absolute squalor, and their bodies like not be found in some cases for a long time if they were just abandoned. People were dying left and right, entire communities being washed away. At some point, we're going to have to do a novel or something that deals with this period. I think that would be appropriate for us to discuss at some point. But like, it really is remarkable. And then you have the finger wagging, which is just such this like sort of imperial arrogance of, it doesn't matter what I did. When you admit that also is wrong, and then you lie, and then if you correct the lie, well, that individual detail was bad, wasn't it? And then maybe the individual detail was bad, maybe it wasn't. But at that point, you've lost the plot, and you're just trying to get some kind of equalization, and it's completely faulty, which is why queer people everywhere, like Feinberg argues, needs to uphold the Cuban Revolution, not just because of the fact that the Cuban Revolution has steadily advanced in the fight for queer liberation, but also because like we should support people's right to self-determination, because we should support our own right to self-determination. So I thought that section on responding to the AIDS epidemic was spot on. And really kind of, it moves, moving into the end here, it talks about some other cases. I really loved it talking about sort of, artistic groups of people who were drag queens and cross-dressers and trans women who were, when they didn't have enough, resources because of the blockade, they were literally like using like horsehair and stuff for their eyelashes, really whatever made it work. It was beautiful. The people who were concerned about whether or not it was ethical, they were pushing through, and they were getting in like workers collectives and stuff to do their performances, to show people through, again, revolutionary art, that they are people, and here they are. this continued process all the way through until even more significant legal breakthroughs are made. And also, trans operations begin, and gender affirming care begins to be covered in full by the Cuban National Health Service, which is really remarkable.
There's a bit here, and you're going to unpack it, but I want to preface it, right? There's a bit here where Mariela Castro says, yeah, the Constitution needs to be updated to include protections for sexual orientation. It's not enough to repeal the laws criminalizing homosexuality, criminalizing LGBT behavior of this or that stripe. You have to have a commitment written into the law of the country to combat these things, not just in the legal sphere, but in the attitudinal sphere, of course. And it says here, no Cuban of any sex has to marry in order to have economic support, a job, a home, health care, or other rights that are guaranteed to every person. Castro Espin pointed out, although homosexuals live within the law in consensual relationships, gay marriage is not recognized, so you have many issues such as inheritance that aren't fully resolved. We need changes in the family code itself related to these and other questions, including domestic violence. Senasex at the time had presented 2 bills in Parliament before the Education and Children's Commissions having to do with gender. They've been well received. So these are things, again, that need to be worked out, that they're working on. And, as of a couple of years ago, we had just that happen, didn't we?
Mm-hmm.
We did.
The 2022 Código de la Familia was not amended, but worked a bit. And I think I actually found it's Artículo 4, the rights of the persons. And one of it says, okay, I'll say it in Spanish first and then in English because the document is in Spanish. Pero it says, el desarrollo pleno de los derechos sexuales y reproductivos en el entorno familiar, independiente de su sexo, género, orientación sexual y identidad de género, situación de discapacidad o cualquier otra circunstancia personal, incluyendo el derecho a la información científica sobre la sexualidad, la salud sexual y la planificación familiar, en todo caso, apropiadas por su edad. So I think first it's important to note that the family code, the most important aspect of it is that they redefine family based not on blood, but on affection. And so that's very monumental when you consider the advancement of rights for LGBTQ people. That really greatly expands it because now the family isn't just strictly like this very binary thing or anything like that. It's not just restricted to that. It's literally based on affection. And so the bit that I just read talks a little bit about how the desarrollo, the plain sexual rights and also reproductive rights of someone, it's given to you regardless of your sex, gender identity, orientation, also your ability or any other personal circumstances. And that you also have information over your sexual health and the planning of the family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's just the Family Code 2022 is so expansive, so inclusive. It is also considered to be the most progressive family law and set of laws to be passed in the entire world. And it was done so because of consistent grassroots efforts, honestly, and consistent conversations. I think I can't remember the exact number, but it's up into like the hundreds of thousands of meetings were being held over multiple years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've actually got some information. The meetings that were done talking about the revisions to the Cuban Constitution and new laws, I mean, the whole population was involved. It's worth noting. So there are 6,251,000 eligible voters in Cuba, or at least there were at the time in 2022. Over 6 million Cubans, so around that exact same number, were involved in conversations around what the new constitution could be. There was over 6 million people that attended workplace meetings, neighborhood meetings, mass organizing meetings. For Cubans abroad, there were every like major Cuban embassy and Cuban centers, they were letting Cubans abroad weigh in on their opinions. They had their website up where any Cuban national could submit questions and recommendations. In-person discussions were being held constantly. This was over a period. I mean, they had 900,000 personnel assigned to organizing this process alone because it was so critical. And that's like what real democracy is. There was criticism and debate. And from what I read about it, people were yelling at each other. And there was more to it than just these family codes. But guess what? Like, they hashed out, and I'm sure there was, in different places, not everyone got everything they wanted perfectly, precisely. But what they did was they, from all the people, got this creative, clever, truly democratic constitution that they have forged. And guess what? Also, the Cuba allows it. So if that constitution needs to be amended, it's a hell of a lot easier to amend it than it is here. Not easier in the sense that it can be done, with a snap. There has to be people who are consulted, but easier as in the sense of the legal process it is actually possible to pass like constitutional amendments as here. Like, come on, when are we going to pass another constitutional amendment? Let's get
listeners, show of hands, as if I can see you.
I can see them.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Jacob, you can report back to me on that. How many of y'all listeners were consulted on, Trump's murderous budget bill that just recently passed?
A worrying amount of them are raising their hands, but they all seem to be in DC. Not sure what's going on there, but whatever.
How often is it really that we get to be involved in this decision-making process beyond, calling our elected representatives and begging them not to vote on something that will kill us, right?
I really hope they need to like change their like answering machine message to like, this is Raphael Warnock, go fuck yourself. Like, I really feel like that when I try to call into their office, even the Democrats, even like the more progressive, like Raphael Warnock in particular, someone who is probably on the progressive end on these LGBT issues. And even then it's like, I don't feel like these people actually are like engaged in the way that even if they do interpersonally care, the structure of US politics makes us so fundamentally removed from them that it doesn't matter.
When he's not voting to bomb gay Palestinians or to mandate detention of gay immigrants under the racist Lake and Riley Act. There is so much more. Again, it takes a lot of work to get this thing done, but that's the thing. We are involved in that work in the first place if we live in a socialist society that facilitates that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Compare something like the family code, right, to a genuine commitment to anti bigotry, right, enshrined in law via national meetings on this island-wide scale. Compare this to Democrats saying, "Oh, we need healthcare," and then what do? They sign into law the Affordable Care Act, which is a Republican plan originally, which is a huge wealth transfer to private insurance. Does it help some people in the short term? Sure, absolutely. I'm on an ACA plan, but it's vulnerable to being undemocratically dismantled. Is the thing. This is not that.
Mm-hmm. Are you going to tell me that the big, beautiful bill, there weren't mass meetings to decide how that was drafted, Lenore?
Oh, yeah. I personally wrote some of the language that allocates $300 million for the Secret Service to party at Mar-a-Lago. It's my finest achievement yet.
Please tell me that you got like some kind of like cutout for us in the bill. Honestly, you could give us like $10 million in that monstrosity and no one would notice.
Listen.
Like,
if I got it,
literally me and you for this podcast.
If I got kickbacks from the American state, I wouldn't be open about it, but there would be signs.
There would be signs. We would have a recording studio. It would be awesome. It would be in Cuba. But all in all, very, very interesting text here. And what we have is basically a story of a revolution, a revolution within a revolution, just as the women's rights movement was. This is a revolution within a revolution that has to be fought everywhere. And we get this question all the time, with different socialist and anti-imperialist projects. Like, there are contradictions with women's rights, with racial issues, with LGBT issues. And the answer is, it is on the working class of those countries to fight for that. And that I believe that they will. When somebody asks me, And I'm not just talking about socialist countries here either. I'm just talking about countries that the United States sees as an enemy. You know, morally, not even making like a moral judgment, just saying like a country like Iran, right? That objectively treats LGBT people poorly. Nobody here disagreeing with that. When people say, therefore we need to bomb them, versus me saying, no, actually, and anyone who actually thinks about it for 2 seconds would say the same. No, actually, what we need is to build a world in which the working class of that country, and specifically the queer working class of that country, can rise up and not feel like any kind of movement they need to do is going to be co-opted by U.S. imperialism, but instead is going to be something that's used for true like liberation, and we can stand in solidarity with them 100%. And these things are going to happen. These movements are going to happen anywhere and everywhere, and it does not matter how many times you put us down. If here in the United States you fully put down the LGBT rights movement somehow, you get rid of every LGBT rights organizer, you lock us all up, you scrub all our content from the internet, give it only a little bit of time, and we're going to be fucking back, because we have always been here. We will always be here. And we're going to crop up in different ways, and we're going to continue to fight. And, you know, and when we're embedded in working class organizing, and when the working class realizes we're one of them, and we realize we are one of the working class, we're fucking unstoppable. Folks, do we have any more thoughts before we wrap this one up?
All I'll say is, you know, there are those who say, well, you know, why isn't this or that movement of marginalized people independent of the state in Cuba if they're so free? And it's like, because the state is on their side. You know, this is a question that people are asking in bad faith in a country in the United States where churches have just been allowed to engage in political advocacy, you know, where churches don't pay taxes. You know, you cannot say the same of, you know, just think of all the you know, all the vigilance that you have to maintain if you're a nonprofit, if you're a political party that's trying to organize for the rights of marginalized people in this country. You know, they are trying to threaten your, you know, the American state is trying to threaten your ability to do that at every turn. So here in this country, the strength of one's organization, the strength of one's movement is it's in direct proportion to the degree of independence from that structure.
Absolutely. Well, we have to continue to organize independently from that structure until we can build a structure that we can all be part of in a way that we can feel is honest and real and democratic. And we're going to learn lessons from the Cubans, and we're going to learn lessons from people all over the world. And we're going to have to figure some new stuff out ourselves. And that only happens through organizing and direct input and direct work, the kind of stuff that Matteo is doing. So Matteo, we really appreciate you coming on. Is there anything you want to say as we're signing off here? Any last messages you want to give?
I guess just that the U.S. inhumane blockade on Cuba should be ended.
Yes.
Y que la lucha sigue.
No doubt. Well, we appreciate y'all. And Lenore, you got to sign off here. Anything?
Lift the blockade. Yeah, that's really all there. That's really all there is to it. You know,
we usually to sign off with a joke, but we aren't joking this time. If y'all haven't gotten rid of the blockade by the time this episode comes out, I'm going to be very, very
countries under an incredible state of siege from the biggest imperialist power punch well above their weight in terms of social progress, in terms of physical quality of life. Just imagine what they could do free of the American yoke.
And the blockade. Thanks, y'all. Have a good one.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.